Tokyo is a city that never truly sleeps. Neon lights blaze through the night, painting the streets in harsh colors, and the sound of footsteps and chatter never fully dies down, even at 3 in the morning. But tucked away from the wide boulevards and main stations, narrow alleys hide the capsule hotels, rows of stacked pods where tired travelers slide into coffin-sized beds, seeking a cheap and convenient place to rest. Kenta, a 27-year-old salaryman, stumbled into one of these late one night. He had missed his last train home after drinking too much at a company party. Capsule hotels were supposed to be safe, efficient, and unremarkable. A place to sleep, nothing more. He paid at the counter, received his keycard, and climbed up to the 3rd floor. His capsule was number 314. It was already past 2 in the morning by the time he crawled inside. The space was narrow and suffocating, with just enough room to stretch out on a thin mattress. He slid the curtain shut, placed his bag against the wall, and tried to calm his buzzing head. But the moment he lay down, something felt wrong. The air inside the capsule was unnaturally cold, like stepping into a freezer. Kenta rubbed his arms, puzzled. Maybe the air conditioning vent blew harder in this section, he thought. Still, the chill sank into his bones, making it impossible to relax. Then came the sound. It wasn't the usual footsteps of other guests moving through the corridor. This was softer, closer, and disturbingly intimate. A faint shuffling noise, like fingers or knees dragging along the inside of the walls. As if someone or something was crawling within the capsules themselves, slithering just beyond reach. Kenta squeezed his eyes shut and forced himself to sleep, praying it was only his imagination. Chapter 2. At exactly 3:14 a.m. Kenta's eyes snapped open as if some invisible hand had shaken him awake. For a moment, he thought it was just a dream, the residue of alcohol and exhaustion from the previous night playing tricks on his mind. But then he heard it faint, almost imperceptible, a whisper that slid against his ear like cold smoke. "Why are you here?" His entire body froze. The voice was so soft, so intimate, it felt as if someone's lips were brushing against his skin. He jerked upright in his capsule, heart hammering so violently he thought it might echo through the paper-thin walls. With trembling fingers, he yanked the curtain open. The corridor outside stretched in silence. Row after row of identical capsules, stacked neatly like drawers in a morgue, stared back at him. Each curtain was drawn tight, each pod sealed in its own pocket of silence. Not a single footstep echoed, not a single voice replied. Only the constant hum of the old ventilation system filled the air, an eerie drone that seemed to mask something beneath it. Kenta's breath came in ragged pulls. He held it, straining his ears, but the sound was gone. No whisper, no movement, nothing. Still, the feeling that someone or something had been inches from his face lingered, a chill crawling under his skin. He ducked back inside, pulling the curtain closed with shaky hands. His phone screen lit up as he reached for it. The numbers glowed. 3:14 a.m. Pod 314. His mind snagged on the coincidence like a fishhook. The match was too neat, too deliberate, as though the universe itself was playing some kind of cruel joke. Trying to convince himself it was just nerves, he forced his body back down onto the thin mattress. But the moment his head hit the pillow, it returned. The whisper. Louder this time. Clearer. It sliced through the hum of the building and slithered straight into his ear. "Get out before it takes you." Kenta bolted upright, his breath catching in his throat. He wasn't imagining it. He couldn't be. The words carried weight, intention, almost desperation. Something in that voice wasn't merely trying to frighten him, it was warning him. And then he felt it. The wall beside him shifted under pressure. Not a creak of plastic, not the settling of cheap construction, but a solid, deliberate push. Something heavy pressed against the thin barrier of his capsule. The shape was unmistakable, the faint outline of a face pressing forward, as though someone on the other side was leaning against it, trying to force themselves through. Kenta's throat went dry. He pressed his palm against the wall, the way you might test if something was real. It was shockingly cold, like ice, and yet utterly empty. His hand passed over smooth, dead plastic. No bulge, no outline, no warmth. But still, that feeling of presence lingered, pressing back at him, suffocating him in his own coffin-sized space. He curled into himself, shivering, unable to tell if the cold in the capsule came from the air conditioning or from whatever had seeped into the walls around him. Minutes stretched into hours, or at least it felt that way, as he sat awake, fighting the urge to scream, fighting the terror that if he closed his eyes, the Whisperer would crawl fully into his pod. Somewhere around dawn, exhaustion finally smothered his panic. His body sagged against the mattress. When the faint grey light of morning filtered through the capsule curtains of the guests across from him, Kenta slid out, his limbs heavy with fatigue. Every step toward the lobby felt unreal, as if he were moving through water. He found himself at the front desk, his voice barely steady. "Hey," he said casually, forcing a smile. "Has anyone ever complained about noises in pod 314? The clerk, a young man with a tired but polite face, froze for just a fraction of a second. His eyes flickered, his lips pressed tight, and his smile faltered. That half second was all Kenta needed to know, but then the clerk smoothed it over. His lips stretched into the same rehearsed, professional cheer every service worker wore like armor. "No, sir," he said brightly. "None at all. Guests sleep very well here." The lie was obvious, brittle, thin, as the capsule walls themselves. Kenta nodded slowly, pretending to accept it. He turned away from the counter, but the truth weighed on him heavier than his own exhaustion. Someone had whispered to him that night. Something had pressed against the wall, and whether the staff admitted it or not, Pod 314 held more than just tired travelers. The chill clung to him as he left, trailing him into the morning streets of Shinjuku. The city buzzed awake around him, neon signs flickering off, vendors rolling up their shutters, taxis honking, but the noise couldn't wash away what had happened in that capsule. For Kenta, the silence of the corridor still echoed louder than any sound in Tokyo, and the warning voice still lingered in his ear. "Get out, before it takes you." Chapter 3. 2 nights later, Kenta found himself standing once again in front of the narrow glass doors of the Capsule Hotel. The neon lights of Shinjuku buzzed overhead, their glow reflected in his tired eyes. He didn't want to be there. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to go home, to never come back. But peer pressure has a way of bending reason. His friends had laughed at him in the bar the night before, waving off his story as drunken paranoia. "You're just drunk last time, man. Capsule hotels aren't haunted," they chuckled, raising their glasses. "If you're really scared, prove us wrong. Stay there again. Record it if you want." Against his better judgment, Kenta agreed. Some part of him wanted to prove to himself that he hadn't lost his mind, that the whispers and the icy presence weren't just a trick of fatigue and alcohol. And so, with dread anchoring every step, he walked back through the hotel's automatic doors and up to the desk. The same clerk from before greeted him, a strained smile on his face. For an instant, Kenta swore the man's eyes flickered with recognition, almost as if he was silently asking, "Why did you come back?" But his mouth formed the same polite words as last time. "Welcome back, sir. Would you like your previous capsule?" Kenta forced a nod. "Yeah, Pod 314. This time, however, he came prepared. Earlier that day, he had visited a small, weather-worn temple tucked behind Shinjuku's endless skyscrapers. The monk there was old, his back bent like an ancient tree, but his eyes were sharp. Kenta had purchased a cheap Ofuda talisman, a slip of paper inscribed with protective prayers. The old monk pressed it into his palm and leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Be careful near Shinjuku," he said, his tone grave. "That land was once filled with the dead." Kenta frowned, but the monk continued before he could ask more. "Execution grounds. The cries of those left unburied still echo. They cling to the earth waiting. Some do not forgive." The words burrowed deep into Kenta's mind. Even as he returned to the bright, modern streets, he couldn't shake the thought that beneath the neon glow and concrete towers, the soil still remembered blood. That night, Kenta slid into Pod 314 with the talisman clutched tightly in his hand. He placed it carefully above his pillow, muttering a short, awkward prayer. His voice shook, but he hoped the spirits, if they truly lingered, would hear. For a while, nothing stirred. The capsule was quiet, suffocatingly so, but not hostile. Hours trickled by in silence, and he began to believe that maybe it had just been exhaustion last time. Maybe the monk's words were only old superstition. He almost allowed himself to relax. Almost, until the temperature began to drop. At first, it was subtle, a coolness around his fingertips, like the faint draft from an open window. But within minutes, the air turned glacial. His breath fogged in the darkness, pale mist spilling from his lips as though he were in the middle of winter. He rubbed his arms, trying to generate warmth, but the chill seeped into his bones. The tiny pod became a freezer, and he realized with dawning horror that the rest of the corridor remained unchanged. He could still hear faint snores from other capsules, unbroken, undisturbed. Whatever was happening, it was happening only in his pod. Kenta's phone, resting by his side, flickered to life. The screen glowed briefly, then sputtered like a candle in the wind. Static lines rolled across it, distorting the numbers until they pulsed in sync with his heartbeat. He swallowed hard. His stomach turned to ice as the whispering returned, but this time it didn't come from beyond the walls. It didn't come from the corridor. It came from inside the capsule. "You shouldn't have come back." The voice crawled under his skin, soft but venomous, as though it were speaking directly into his thoughts. Kenta froze, too terrified to move, his eyes darting around the narrow space. The curtain quivered gently, though no one touched it. His breath hitched in his throat. Then he felt it. Fingers, cold, damp, like they had been buried in wet soil. They brushed against his ankle. Kenta kicked violently, pressing his back against the wall of the pod. "Who's there?" he shouted, but the words came out strangled. His throat was closing, tightening around his fear. The sound came next, a noise no human should make in such a confined space. It was the wet, deliberate scrape of something crawling, elbows and knees dragging forward across the plastic floor. The sound was impossibly close behind his head, as if someone had wriggled into the pod with him. He spun around, his hands clawing at the shadows. Empty. The capsule was bare, save for his belongings and the trembling talisman above his pillow. Yet the smell lingered thick, suffocating. The scent of damp earth mixed with iron, rot, and the unmistakable tang of blood. Kenta gagged, pressing his hand to his nose, but the stench only grew stronger. The air itself tasted foul, choking him. And then it happened. The Ofuda, the one thing he had clung to for safety, burst into flames. A sudden, violent fire that illuminated the pod in hellish light. The paper curled, blackened, and vanished in seconds, leaving only drifting ash. The fire should have set off alarms, should have scorched his pillow, but the flames consumed nothing else. They burned only the talisman. As though something had rejected it, spat it out. Kenta stared, wide-eyed, his body trembling uncontrollably. His protection was gone. His only shield had been stripped from him in an instant. And in the heavy silence that followed, the crawling sound began again, closer, louder, until the breath of whatever it was brushed against the back of his neck. Chapter 4. By now, Kenta was screaming. His voice tore through the quiet of the Capsule Hotel, echoing down the narrow corridors like a wounded animal. The sudden noise stirred other guests from their restless sleep. Curtains rustled. Pale, disoriented faces peeked out from pods, blinking in confusion and irritation. A young man in the pod opposite him rubbed his eyes and frowned. "Kenta, are you okay?" he asked groggily, his voice trembling. "Why are you outside your capsule?" Kenta froze. Outside? His heart pounded as he spun around, clawing desperately at the walls of his capsule. But the smooth plastic surface he expected was gone. His fingernails dug into something damp and unyielding. When he pulled his hands back, his fingers were coated in dirt. Thick, wet earth crumbled under his nails. Panic surged like a tidal wave. He wasn't inside the capsule anymore, he was underground. Buried alive. "No, no, I'm still inside," he screamed, pounding against the walls, but his fists met only soil, packed tight and suffocating. Each strike seemed to draw the earth closer, squeezing him in, choking the air from his lungs. His chest heaved, desperate for breath that would not come. Around him, the muffled voices of other guests rose in confusion. To them, the corridor was calm. They saw only his capsule curtain pulled closed, trembling slightly as if from a restless dream. No matter how violently Kenta screamed, they couldn't hear. His voice was trapped in another world. Then came the sound, a wail, thin and piercing, slicing through the earth itself. It was a woman's cry, long and mournful, filled with rage. Kenta's blood turned to ice. The cry shifted, growing closer until it wasn't just around him, it was inside him, reverberating in his skull. And then he saw her. From the shifting soil near his face, a pale form pushed through. First came the suggestion of hair, long and matted, streaked with mud. Then her face emerged, hollow sockets where eyes should have been, empty and black, yet somehow staring directly into him. Her mouth split wide, far wider than any human jaw should allow, stretching grotesquely toward her ears. From that jagged maw spilled dirt and whispers, the voice of the grave. "This is mine. she hissed, her tone sharp and guttural, filled with centuries of hate. Kenta screamed until his throat burned raw. He flailed, thrashing against the soil that buried him, clawing at the apparition. But the more he fought, the deeper the earth swallowed him. His lungs filled with dirt, choking him, cutting off his cries. He gagged, spitting mud, but the soil poured endlessly into his mouth, as though the earth itself was devouring him. The woman's face drew closer, her breath colder than ice, brushing against his skin. Her cracked lips moved again, repeating the same chilling words, each syllable stabbing deeper than any blade. This is mine, this is mine, this is mine. In the corridor above, the guests watched in unease. They whispered among themselves, "Why is he screaming? Is he having a nightmare? Should we get the staff?" A few moved closer, knocking gently on the thin plastic of pod 314. "Hey man, wake up, you're scaring people." But no answer came. The curtain didn't move. The pod remained sealed, trembling slightly as if something inside pressed against it from within. Eventually, the whispers died down. Guests retreated into their capsules, too unnerved to intervene, too eager to convince themselves it was nothing more than a bad dream. Only silence remained. When dawn broke, the capsule hotel returned to its usual routine. The cleaning staff moved down the rows, checking pods, changing sheets, and resetting the spaces for new arrivals. When they reached pod 314, they paused. The curtain was closed. The guest registered to it, Kenta, should have checked out hours ago. Yet the pod was sealed shut. The staff slid it open carefully. The capsule was empty. No trace of Kenta remained, at least, not visibly. His wallet, his bag, and his phone sat neatly inside, untouched. The air, however, was heavy with a damp smell, the faint odor of soil after rain. One of the cleaners reached inside and recoiled instantly. The bedding was wet, soaked, not with water, but with something darker, something that stained the sheets like earth mixed with blood. They said nothing. They changed the bedding, removed the belongings, and noted in the records that the guest had checked out early. That was the story they told. That was the story they repeated to anyone who asked. But among themselves, they whispered the truth. Even today, staff members lower their voices when speaking of pod 314. Guests often complain of strange occurrences, cold air seeping through the pod, the sensation of fingers brushing across their skin, or the faint sound of sobbing echoing in the night. Some swear they hear scratching, as though nails drag across the walls, always at the same time, 3:14 a.m. When confronted, the staff smile politely, just as they did with Kenta, and insist that the hotel is perfectly safe. "It must have been the air conditioning," they say. "You were dreaming." Their voices are calm, rehearsed, but their eyes betray them, flicking nervously toward pod 314 whenever the topic arises. No one stays long in that capsule. Most who try request to move the next morning, their faces pale and their eyes ringed with sleeplessness. A few leave in the middle of the night, abandoning their belongings altogether. The hotel returns their items, but the guests never return for themselves. And for those few who stubbornly insist on staying, well, their stories rarely end the same. Some claim to wake in the night buried in soil, gasping for breath, clawing their way back to the surface only to find themselves inside the capsule once again. Others whisper of seeing her, the woman with the eyeless face and the mouth split too wide, waiting at the foot of their bed, her body pressed into the tiny space as though she belonged there and the guest did not. No matter the version, one truth always remains. Pod 314 does not like to be disturbed. It belongs to her, and those who dare to challenge that ownership rarely leave the same.